Welcome to day 2 of Reset. Good morning to everyone in the room and also everyone joining us on Facebook Live. My name is Jessica Alice. I'm the chair of the Arts Industry Council. I'll begin by acknowledging that we are gathering on Kaurna land and acknowledge elders past and present. This always was and always will be sovereign Aboriginal land. So welcome back to Reset for a big second day. For those of you who are just joining us either online in the room, Reset is the product of a coalition between 3 of South Australia's universities and the Arts Industry Council of South Australia. The Arts Industry Council is the state's representative sector-wide arts body, and we advocate for the rights of artists and for the role of culture in public life. Before we begin, I'll start with some housekeeping things before I throw it over to Justin to tell you a little bit more about what to expect from Reset. So just to begin, for those of you joining us online and in the room, you can contribute to the conversation using the hashtags on Twitter. It's Reset Arts or Reset Conference. What else? We will be taking questions in these sessions. So those of you online, you can type your questions in the chat and we will read them out. And we'll have some roving mics towards the end of this session. So start thinking if there's something that you'd like to ask our guests this morning. For those of you in the room, we will be going until midday today, and there'll be a break at that time. Make sure you use the COVID QR check-ins, wear your mask, and I think that's it. So I'll throw it over to Justin O'Connor from the University of South Australia to tell us a bit more about Reset and how we've got to this point with the conference.
Yes, good morning. And I too like to acknowledge that we're on the Kaurna country. And I was going to speak a little bit more about that when we do a wrap up about how transformative the contributions from our Aboriginal speakers were yesterday. And I think really makes, when we do the acknowledgement, makes it much more than a formality, and especially when we've heard some of the things we heard yesterday. But I'll talk about that in a little bit more. Reset came out of the idea of a kind of enough is enough feeling. We're obviously, because of what happened during the pandemic and the underwhelming response from the federal government, certainly, and not just in terms of material response, but the sense of importance or lack of importance that was projected across the sector. And we thought, we really needed to address this and how we ended up in this position, really. So our basic intention was we ran a series of little open sessions where we got different speakers. Some of them spoke yesterday, actually, just to bring in some new ideas, some new languages into the room, to open a window and to get out of the economic metric-based conversation we've had for so long now. So that's what we've been doing, and this conference is part of that learning process. What is out there? What do people think is out there? How are people speaking, not just in the cultural sector, but close by it in other political movements, around First Nations justice, around ecology and sustainability, and other, questions of class and anti-racism. All these things are around. Where does art and culture fit in that? And can we let them into the room, so to speak? So we're at the end of that first year on this, and we'll speak a little bit more about that at the end of the day, about where we think it might go next. So, so that's what I wanted to say about Reset.
Beautiful, thank you. And welcome to everyone who's just joined us in the room. It's great to have you all here at the town hall today. And I'll also acknowledge the supporters of Reset, the Arts Industry Council, UniSA, Flinders University, the University of Adelaide, Arts South Australia and the City of Adelaide, the Don Dunstan Foundation and Arts Front and Feral Arts. So thank you all for joining us. Right, let's move into our first session today. So we are beginning with a keynote. We have two fabulous guests with us in the room and shortly on the screen. We're going to begin following on from some of the conversations that we had yesterday about visioning for arts and culture. So it is a great pleasure to introduce to you Mark Butler, the Federal Member for Hindmarsh and Shadow Minister for Health and Ageing. It's a pleasure to have you with us this morning. We might take a seat with you.
Yeah, sure.
And it's a real pleasure to have you with us today, Mark. We have heard so much throughout the last day from artists, activists, from academics, and from politicians. And so it's wonderful to have you representing the Labor Party and to share your reflections and your visions and perspectives about the last year or so that we have found ourselves in.
Well, thanks so much. And thank you for the acknowledgement of country. And I also acknowledge that we come together either in person or virtually on the lands of the Kaurna people and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and remember how important they are to the cultural history and the legacy of this country. It's a great pleasure to be with you on this beautiful late spring day. I'm going to leave here and get on a ferry to go to Kangaroo Island, which you can imagine is going to be an utter joy. Spend a weekend at an event tonight with it at about 15 degrees and blowing a gale and raining as well. So I'm sorry I can't be with you for the entire session, but it's a great pleasure to come and talk to you at this conference. And although I now sit in the health and ageing portfolio, which is not an obvious connection to your industry, and spent several years in the climate change portfolio, before that, I very much see your industry as a critical part of my job as a Member of Parliament. As a general South Australian Member of Parliament, but particularly as a Member of Parliament who used to represent the seat called Port Adelaide, which was shamefully renamed the seat of Hindmarsh at the last election, but which has been a real hotbed of South Australia and Adelaide's artistic centre. And we've done many of these sessions over the years that I've been an MP, usually at the Waterside Workers Hall, hosted by the redoubtable Vital Statistics. But it's great to have to drive into the city and do this at the Adelaide Town Hall. And congratulations on the agenda that you're seeking to build here through the Reset Conference. I really applaud the idea of a forceful advocacy of a public agenda for the arts, because the arts is not just another economic commodity, as much as it's been framed that way over the last few decades of economic libertarianism. It's a public good. And we must also always remember that it is a driver of economic activity and it is a driver of jobs, and that's important, very important for artists themselves. But overwhelmingly, it is different. It is a public good that is utterly central, as I'm sure Tony will talk about, to our identity as a human race, but our identity as Australians. And so I applaud you, and I really look forward to new ideas about ways in which we as public representatives can continue to project the arts as something more than another economic commodity, but something that we desperately need to be a decent, diverse and deep society. And can I say, we need that more than ever right now as we go through one of these extraordinary periods of history that come along really only every few generations, and they tend to sneak up on you, as this one certainly has snuck up on us. As the Shadow Minister for Health, I'm travelling around the country just seeing, although we have been relatively blessed compared to many other countries around the world, just seeing the level of dislocation and distress and the mental health impacts as well as the economic loss caused by this pandemic. And it's creating, for the first time I can remember at least, two profoundly different experiences that are currently being lived in Australia, or have been lived particularly over the last few months, where you've got essentially half of the population having languished in lockdown for months, with their kids unable to go to school, many people unable to go to work. Extraordinary mental health impacts being recorded by mental health services, but also general health services like emergency departments, not just across the general population, but among cohorts that we're not well set up to support, like under 12-year-olds who are stuck at home, too often in unhappy home situations. And this is a highly traumatic experience being lived by half of our population in Sydney and Melbourne and regional parts of those two states in the ACT. While on the other hand, we in the relatively COVID-free jurisdictions have lived a relatively normal life, and we have to wear masks and there are some impacts, but a relatively normal life. And bringing those two experiences together over coming months in a way that is sensitive to what they in New South Wales and Victoria want, which is for the lockdowns to end as quickly as possible, and what those of us in the COVID-free jurisdictions want, which is to protect what we've been able to preserve over the last few months, is going to be sensitive and it's going to be delicate, and perhaps something that our current Prime Minister is not particularly well equipped to land. But anyway, I digress. It is one of those experiences that that really marks out periods of history. We've seen them over the course of human history before. And the role of artists in recording that and telling the story of these pandemics, these wars, these massive sort of people-wide dislocations that do characterise these periods of history is extraordinarily important. The role of historians is obviously important, but the role of artists is unique because through art, whether it's visual art or performance or any other type of art, you get to look into the mind of an artist. You get to see what they were feeling and what they were experiencing at the time. And it gives you quite a different perspective on one of these tumultuous periods in history to the perspective given by an historian. As much as I love the work of historians, I get much more out of understanding what it was like to live through the first aerial bombings of civilian populations by looking at Guernica than I do by reading any history or photographs of the Spanish Civil War. And it will be that way through this experience as well. And pandemic art has been a powerful force through the history of art. We know this. I mean, if you look at Japanese art, the smallpox demons and their portrayal through the very regular smallpox epidemics that Japan has experienced over the centuries is a very important part of the history of Japanese art. And in Western society, probably we better understand the impact that the different sort of periods of plague, particularly the Black Death, have had, most notably on visual art, but Shakespeare is said to have done some of his best work while what we now call lockdown was imposed on different parts of the UK in the late 1500s and the early 1600s. And I found it fascinating. Again, I digress, not about the Prime Minister this time, but I found it fascinating to read Hilary Mantel's third book in the Wolf Hall trilogy, which she'd written obviously before COVID, but where she writes about lockdowns taking place in the time of Henry VIII. This is an extraordinarily important part of art history. More recently, we saw it through the sort of artistic outpourings, not just from New York and San Francisco and Sydney and London, but more broadly through the community through the 1980s and into the 1990s with the AIDS epidemic as well. More puzzling to art historians is the fact that there's not that rich body of artistic legacy that came out of the Spanish flu, in spite of the fact that it was arguably, certainly in modern history, the most impactful pandemic that we've experienced in modern times. And perhaps that's because it sort of came straight after World War I, which tended to take a lot of the attention of historians and of artists alike. But it seems to me that, that COVID art, in all of its forms, will be an incredibly important way of recording this extraordinary period of history that we're living through. Right now, though, the job is recovery. Right now, the job is to make sure that although the creative juices, I'm sure, are flowing, and although we read from places overseas, in the Northern Hemisphere particularly, that are sort of ahead of Australia in the COVID curve, that art is recovering, and the artists have exploited, as they always do, some of the extraordinary technological leaps that have taken place over the last 20 to 24 months, at least in people's access and understanding of technology that actually did exist before COVID. Although there are signs of those green shoots, the industry here, as well as in other countries, needs to recover. It, like all other sectors of the economy, has taken a big hit over 20 or 24 months of isolation and economic dislocation. And we know, and Tony has talked about this a lot, we know that even before COVID, the industry in Australia was under real pressure. This is an industry always under pressure, but it's an industry that particularly took a big hit with the budget cuts in 2014 and 15, which hit everyone, but my sense hit second and third tier companies particularly hard. In a way, it was designed to do that through the way in which Brandis in particular constructed his fund. But we know that the industry was doing it tough even before the impact of COVID, and dealing with that at a national level was a challenge that Tony, and before Tony, Mark Dreyfus, were all already very, very focused on. And to add insult to injury, as the federal government was designing particular support programs, whether they are for individuals through JobKeeper or industry support programs, the arts, along with some in industry, other sectors of the economy like universities, for example, just didn't get the support that other industries did. And you can draw from that what you will in terms of motivation, but the impact is very clear. The task of recovery for this sector comes off a lower base than some other sectors in our society that, frankly, were given more support from the Morrison government than this one was. I can tell you, not just in the arts portfolio, but in Labor more broadly, Labor is really hungry to be a part of this discussion and part of this debate. And Tony Burke, who you'll hear from very soon, will be leading Labor's participation in that debate. He's a very good friend of mine. He's my boss, actually, in parliamentary sitting weeks, where he's the manager of opposition business, taking all the points of order and making sure that debate sort of stays something like on the rails. And I operate as his deputy, sort of running around the chamber, getting him glasses of water and handing bits of paper hither and thither. But he genuinely is a very good friend and a valued colleague and a passionate supporter of the arts. He was very keen to hold the arts portfolio, and I know it was a direct request from him to his good friend and colleague, Anthony Albanese. And I know Anthony has enormous confidence in Tony's ability to bring to us as a Labor team a really progressive arts policy. And Tony knows, as I know, particularly with Don's eyes sort of piercing my back here. Emma said they follow you around the room, and there is a bit of that with that. We all know, Tony most of all, that he's got very big shoes to fill, because although our party might have not performed perfectly for every year of the last 50 years, we are nonetheless very proud of Labor's legacy to change over the course of modern history in Australia the relationship between government and the arts. And if you get out of this city into others, people tend to talk about Whitlam and the sea change that came from the Whitlam government. The establishment of the Film Commission, the establishment of the Australia Council, the NGA, big increases to funding, so on and so forth. But we know that Gough very much took his lead from the fellow staring over my shoulder. He very much took his lead from the extraordinary work that Don really did in a very short period of time after his re-election in 1970. I mean, his first term was a very busy term in a whole range of respects, but none more than arts. He did so much extraordinary work in those first couple of years, which Gough largely started to replicate at a national level. And we don't have to look back 50 years to be proud of Labor's legacy in the arts. We can look at Keating's Creative Nation. Mike, very much as Premier here in South Australia, had Don's legacy at the front of his mind as he was thinking about what he wanted to do as Premier, and so on and so forth. But Tony has that very much in his mind. He's passionate about this sector, and he knows there's a lot still to learn from South Australia. We don't just have to look back 50 years for us to learn as a nation some really strong lessons about what makes a great, vibrant, progressive arts sector in our community. We can still do that. And that's why Tony and Mark Dreyfus before him did engage with the South Australian sector through the Industry Council as we were formulating our national election policies, and Tony's going to do that again. So thank you very much for having me. Thank you for inviting our Shadow Minister for the Arts to engage with you over the next little while, and wish me luck on the ferry to Kangaroo Island.
Thank you so much for joining us on your very busy morning. Mark Buckler, Federal Member for Hindmarsh. Go well on the ferry. Thank you. All right. We will now move into our next guest. Eddie, are we all good to go? Great. So it is my great pleasure to introduce the Shadow Minister for the Arts, the Honourable Tony Burke.
Thanks very much, Jessica, and thank you to Mark Butler for that really kind introduction. Although I actually sound like a terrible person to work with what Mark described, but really do appreciate the introduction. I'm joining you from the Bidjigal land of the Eora Nation, what is in true COVID fashion. I guess you can tell I'm joining from my garage in Punchbowl with the normal dress code of business shirt, coat and cargo pants and bare feet. I want to thank the team behind the conference, Emma Webb, Jessica Ellis, Tully Barnett and Justin O'Connor. And I'm really glad the conference is being held in Adelaide. Obviously, I wish I could be with you. The way we all miss being able to gather in person, particularly where I am, which is, my local area was the worst of the lockdown areas in Sydney. So we're hungry and eager to be able to engage the way you're doing right now. But I am glad it's being held in Adelaide. The home of the Cabaret Festival, WOME Adelaide, the Fringe, the Adelaide Festival, AusAsia. There is so much that I view as highlights on the calendar for the arts that live in your state. And so I'm glad that the conference is being hosted there. And of course, as Mark Butler referred to, it's also the home of Don Dunstan. And I know the Don Dunstan Foundation's helped bring the conference to life today. As Mark said, Don was a true hero of the arts. And at a personal level, I'm the husband of Sky Lara. Sky's parents moved to South Australia because of Don Dunstan. They weren't artists themselves when they moved, but the reason they wanted that to be a place to live was intrinsically linked to what Don Dunstan was delivering for the arts and culture. Establishing the Adelaide Festival Centre, the State Theatre Company, and of course the South Australian Film Corporation. As a kid growing up in Sydney, the Australian stories that I'd watch were almost always produced by the South Australian Film Corporation. Whether it be Sunday Too Far Away, Picnic at Hanging Rock, Breaker Morant, Storm Boy, and then as the years went on as a production facilitator, Shine, Rabbit Proof Fence, Wolf Creek, Sweet Country. The stories that helped me know Australia were made possible because of the infrastructure and dedication to the arts and culture in South Australia. The conference couldn't have come at a more appropriate time for the arts and the cultural sector in Australia. We're coming out of what we dearly hope is the worst of COVID, a federal election in either March or May of next year, And we have an opportunity now, a really unique opportunity, to ask and focus on some of the really big questions. Where are we now after 2 years of COVID and nearly a decade of coalition government? A government that will be asking for 12 years at the next election. What have we learned about the value that Australians place on arts and culture? How do we rebuild, and what exactly are we aiming for in that rebuilding process? It's important to acknowledge that parts of the arts and culture sector haven't been able to move past the crisis phase. In New South Wales and Victoria, the damage is really deep. Even states like yours, which have escaped the worst lockdowns, have been affected by border closures and continuing density requirements. It's a real frustration I have that often we hear the Treasurer or the Prime Minister talk about everything opening up as though a per square metre ratio doesn't mean that there are some events that are still simply not profitable, not economic, because of the restrictions. The end of lockdown doesn't mean the end of challenges for people in the sector. Although venues are reopening and performances are happening again, those capacity restrictions can make it really hard to turn a profit, and there's little ability to plan for the future. So any discussion of where we go next does need to acknowledge that some parts of the sector are still not able to move forward. Now, challenges for the sector did not begin with COVID. I was the Arts Minister in the last Labor government. My immediate role was to implement Creative Australia. It was the first cultural policy for Australia since the Keating government had launched Creative Nation. As you all know, cultural policy is a lot more than some funding announcements for the arts. When you get your cultural policy right, it affects our health policy, our education policy, our environment policy, our foreign affairs, trade, veterans affairs, tourism. Because a nation with a strong cultural policy is a nation where we know ourselves, know each other, and invite the world to better know us. When people reflect on the man who replaced me as Minister, George Brandis, the conversation often goes to the Brandis cuts to the Australia Council, and I'll say more about them later. Those cuts were deep. They smashed many parts of the small, medium and independent sector, but they weren't the worst thing that happened. Silently, but immediately, Australia went back to having no cultural policy. There were no guiding principles for why supporting culture in this nation was essential. There was no understanding of our storytellers recording our narrative, no understanding of our visual artists reaching into our soul, no care for performance artists challenging us, no regard for our musicians providing the soundtrack to life in Australia. It explains the context of how we reached a situation where we have a government that principally sees the work of artists as a hobby, not real work. The study and training of artists is seen as an indulgence, not training people for real jobs. And even when making the largest funding announcement for the arts that this government has made, Mr. Morrison felt obliged to justify the funds on the basis that there were tradies working on the set as well. In April this year, Arts Minister Paul Fletcher made a speech to the Sydney Institute. It made a whole lot of headlines because he criticised the arts as being too inner city centric, something which ironically was a direct result of the Brandis cuts, smashing the small, medium and independent sector. But the journalists who reported on the speech missed what is perhaps a key paragraph right at the end. And Mr. Fletcher said these words: "We did not want to have a pandemic, but it has given an opportunity for a significant reimagining of the Commonwealth's approach to the arts." Well, whatever the government is imagining, artists aren't playing lead roles in the story this government wants to write. Now, during the pandemic, Labor pushed hard for wage subsidies when the lockdowns were there. But if you wanted to design a wage subsidy that excluded as many artists as possible, JobKeeper would be the program. JobKeeper was indispensable for those people that it reached, but it failed to capture the patterns of employment that are most common in those industries: multiple short-term contracts with different employers, casual and seasonal work. We warned the government of these problems, but they failed to act. Laughably now, the Minister, Paul Fletcher, is trying to claim that he provided $10 billion in JobKeeper and business support to the arts in the early part of the pandemic. How does he get to the $10 billion figure? He includes, as arts workers, people who are in clothing retail, footwear retail, manufacturing and wholesaling, zoological and botanical services, newspaper publishing, all in that figure, just to name a few. If you have to add all that in to get to a figure that you think's justifiable for your support for the arts, you haven't supported the arts. And I've got to say, there'll be a whole lot of people selling clothes at Best and Less who are astonished to find out that Paul Fletcher is in fact their dedicated minister. You then, after JobKeeper had been established, you had the RISE grants. They took 6 months of us campaigning for there to be a dedicated program before anything arrived. It then took another 6 months before any of that money made it out the door. But because of the way they designed it, the money went to promoters for events that didn't happen. It then meant 12 months later, the money still hadn't reached artists. The single biggest piece of their so-called rescue package was $90 million worth of subsidised loans. It barely got off the ground. In the month before it finished, of the $90 million, only $7.8 million had been spent out of 90. The government tried to spin this as a sign they'd done so well in giving the government support that the loans weren't necessary. But it was always the case that the last thing most of the sector needed was an opportunity to take on more debt, given the debt that people were already drowning in through the pandemic. The strongest impression is possibly one of absence or of drift. The government didn't do enough. There wasn't enough funding, not enough support during the crisis for the arts, not enough of anything. But that impression that it just wasn't enough would be wrong. If it was simply they hadn't done enough, we'd be in a better place right now. Close observers of the arts and culture, like all of you, know there is something deeper and more destructive at play. When the minister says he wants a significant reimagining of the Commonwealth's approach to the arts, that's not something said lightly. It has meaning. It is deliberate. But I want to make this point. Given how extraordinary and damaging the COVID period has been for arts and culture, it is easy to forget that things were difficult beforehand, that the sector had been pushed to the brink by coalition funding cuts and neglect, and was more vulnerable to the shocks of COVID for that reason. The relentless attacks by the coalition on the Australia Council, starting with Brandis, had left it diminished and lacking the financial firepower to properly serve the Australian arts community. In the most recent round of 4-year funding grants announced in April 2020, the number of small to medium arts organisations to receive funding was down by a quarter. These grants are a lifeline for the small to medium sector, and that lifeline was cut. And just before COVID hit, that's when the cut happened. At the end of 2019, the federal government had even removed the word arts from appearing in the title of any federal department. The Office of the Arts ending up in the same mega department as infrastructure and transport. So coming into the early months of 2020, morale was already pretty low. To map the trajectory of the federal government's ideological attacks on the arts, you have to start in the obvious place, George Brandis and Catalyst. Now, Mr. Brandis was not quiet about his agenda for the arts. He wanted to remake it in his own image, and he did so by ripping $105 million out of the Australia Council and creating his own discretionary fund. The impact on those organisations which depended on Australia Council funding was severe. In the 2016 round of 4-year funding grants, 62 organisations lost funding, including your very own Vital Statistics, Slingsby Theatre, Contemporary Art Centre South Australia. The intent was so clear and the means so destructive that the backlash was swift, it was strong. The government was eventually shamed into abolishing Catalyst and returning part of the funding to Australia Council, but by the time they abolished Catalyst, most of the funding had been committed. So the Australia Council then became the manager of contracts that Mr. Brandis had already chosen personally. Now he's gone, but a clear thread can be drawn from his actions to what Mr. Fletcher's done in the last 12 to 18 months. There was also in the middle, Mitch Fifield's tenure, who was Arts Minister because it came with communications. But in terms of the big periods of shifts, it was Mr. Brandis and now Mr. Fletcher. The coalition's agenda has not changed since those destructive days of Mr. Brandis. It just went underground and for some people became harder to detect. First, Australia Council funding has never recovered from the damage done by Catalyst. In the last Labor government budget in 2013, appropriations for the Australia Council were $223 million. In this financial year, they're predicted to be $220 million. So this financial year, 8 years later, the funding is still, with all the extra costs that are there, funding for the Australia Council is still $3 million lower than what it was in the last Labor government. Nearly a decade on, we're still not back to where we were, despite population growth and a significant increase in demand for grants. Secondly, in the last 2 years, under the cover of the pandemic, we've seen another government funding model emerge to rival the arm's-length peer-reviewed Australia Council model. While Mr. Brandis had Catalyst, Mr. Fletcher has Rise. Now, remember, for a long time, the government was planning something worse than an inadequate set of Rise grants. It was planning no response. We fought bitterly to demand a government response specifically tailored for the arts, entertainment and event sectors. Now, this fight seems a lifetime ago, but it's worth remembering that straight after arts workers had been asked to work for free at bushfire relief events, the government intention had been to offer no support for artists. So it had been the usual thing. When someone's doing it tough, we need artists to have their back and turn up for free. But when artists are doing it tough, the government doesn't view those as real jobs. They eventually announced Rise, $200 million for the grant scheme, to be with the grants to be chosen by the Minister, not the Australia Council. Applications are made to the department, which then puts forward a short list of preferred projects, which goes to the Minister, who's the ultimate decision maker. The recipients of these grants have disproportionately been commercial, some going to very large for-profit companies, which had not previously received or asked for government funding. During a pandemic, we did, and I'm not troubled by commercial businesses receiving support when they previously hadn't required it. But I am deeply concerned about increasing processes where it is the Minister making decisions about artistic merit. Now, in making those points, I want to make it clear, I don't criticise the recipients of the Rise grants. There's thousands of arts workers, cast members, children's entertainers, musicians who were grateful for the Rise grant money. They needed it, they deserved it. The live music sector, it's been one of my missions, I guess, ever since I first had the portfolio as Minister, to make sure that we reach into contemporary music as well, even though traditionally federal policy hadn't in any significant way. But why individual grants are chosen by the Minister, I mean, that decision-making process is impenetrable. Why some miss out and others, including some with no record of ever delivering live music before, made it over the line, is a mystery. And the only answer to that mystery is two words: Paul Fletcher. Other than his name, we don't know why these decisions were made. There'll always be media and public criticism at different points of decisions that the Australia Council makes. But I would rather have peers be making decisions about artistic merits than ministers, including when I've been Minister and when I intend to be Minister again. As Arts Minister, I established the Office of Live Music to provide support for what's generally considered a commercial sector. It's a legacy I'm really proud of. Most of the improvements in policy for live performance, which have occurred at state and a local level over the past decade, have been informed by the work of the Office for Live Music. There's good reason for moving into some of the commercial sectors where we previously hadn't been, and there can be good policy outcomes if it's done on a sectoral basis. But the reason we need to talk about RISE isn't because it was inherently bad. I know some people take that view, but because it's so different. I mean, I believe part of the significant reimagining of the Commonwealth's approach to the arts that Mr. Fletcher was talking about in his speech is exactly this: a reimagining where the minister makes the decisions about artistic merits to allow them ultimately to engage in a whole series of culture wars rather than to have a peer-reviewed process with the Australia Council. The $200 million could have gone into measures which would have been a real structural support for the whole industry, a targeted wage subsidy, a live events interruption insurance scheme, both measures which I've strongly argued for and which are still required now. But instead it went to a grants program. It allowed the government to pick winners and losers. It provided less overall for the sector. But why? Why did they do this? Because if it's a grant system, the minister gets to make the announcements, the politicians get to front the cameras, and you get better publicity from a grant system than you get out of something that in fact delivers the best targeted sectoral support. These failings had real consequences. According to Live Performance Australia, $1.4 billion was wiped from the live entertainment industry nationally in 2020, a 70% decline from the previous year. A survey done by I Lost My Gig found 23,000 gigs were cancelled in July this year alone. The failure of the government's COVID response measures, it's clear and it's devastating. So from Labor's perspective, last year, when it looked like we were coming out of the pandemic, Mr. Morrison talked about a snapback for a while, and that was until it became clear people didn't just want to go back to the way things were before COVID hit. He then stopped using it. But the same goes for the arts on snapback. We can't just go back to where things were before COVID because it wasn't good enough then. There are two things the government can do right now, and they don't need to wait for an election because they're required right now to help the sector. That's to introduce now a targeted wage subsidy to help the sector get back on its feet without the 12-month casual rule that they put on JobKeeper, and an interruption insurance scheme for live events. Yeah, anyone engaging in the arts engages in risk, and you're on for that. But COVID shutdowns, if a new variant arrives, those sorts of issues are something not only that you can't manage that risk, you can no longer get commercial insurance against that risk. And if it does happen, it is a decision of government over which you have zero control. The sector's been lobbying the government for the insurance scheme since the end of 2020, but it's not too late for the government to come to the table here. It would allow large companies or even sole traders to make a decision about paying for a percentage of the sum to be insured, and then to have the confidence to know that that part of the financial risk was taken away. It makes a huge difference to someone putting a national tour together as to whether or not they can do that knowing that they can't run at a financial loss in any of the cities that they might otherwise be involved in that national tour. You shouldn't have to put $1 million on the line when you're planning a festival over a risk over which you have no control. There's a clear market failure here, and the government should act. As an opposition, which is a title that I'm hoping to not have next time I talk to you, we have a really big job to do when it comes to the arts. The policy-making challenge is a difficult one, as I don't need to tell you, the whole sector is in a huge state of flux at the moment. And this is why I'm talking in terms of what needs to be done right now, rather than what we will bring to you in May of next year or March. The facts are, if I'd written the policy 3 weeks ago, it would now be out of date. If I'd written the policy 3 months ago, it would be completely out of date now, because things are in such a state of flux. This is why it is so important that a minister during this time doesn't have as a starting point that they're the know-it-all. They need to be constantly engaging, constantly listening, because what's happening on the ground is changing. but we need to rebuild from the ground up. It'll require hard work, bold thinking, and conferences like these are just the start. So my first task as Minister would be to listen. I want to hear from each part of the sector around the country what they need to recover and rebuild. And it's pretty clear that a stocktake of this kind will be needed because it'll take some time for the true impact of COVID on the sector to reveal itself. In terms of new variants, Delta is only the fourth letter of the Greek alphabet. We don't know what's coming with variants. We hope that we don't deal with anything like we just have. Some companies that have made it through 2020 and 21 because of government support may struggle in 2022. Personnel and skills shortages may only become clear when performances return to pre-COVID levels. And on the flip side, new growth and new opportunities will emerge. Anyone who came here today expecting clear announcements of future Labor government policy, I know that part of it's a letdown, but I can give you the principles that are going to be our guiding lights should we win government in 2022. I've spent most of my time in Parliament in this portfolio now, and all of them until the pandemic, presuming that everybody understood the economic value of the sector, and I saw my task as advancing the cultural value. There's a sort of line that if you have to use the dollars to justify it, then you're missing the added value that the arts provides. But what became clear, me thinking that the cultural value was the fight to have, last year, the other side of politics doesn't even see artists as workers. It doesn't see arts companies as businesses. It's all hobbies and indulgences. So let me start with a guiding principle that we would have in government, and I'm a bit embarrassed that this even needs to be said. Artists are workers and need to be respected as workers. Labor's never been blind to this reality. We know that artists, when we talk about the gig economy, artists are the original gig workers. You've been living in the world of insecure work for longer than many other industries. I'm really glad that our industrial relations policies, which Anthony Albanese announced last year, will help workers in the arts and culture sector. The measures include extending the powers of the Fair Work Commission to include employee-like forms of work, allowing it to better protect gig workers, legislating a fair and objective test of casual work, and working with state and territory governments, unions, industry to work out whether or not there are areas where portable entitlement schemes for Australians can be delivered in insecure work. Our second guiding principle, Australian stories first. The current government haven't just neglected Australian stories. There is an attack going on against Australian stories. That might sound dramatic, but look at the evidence. The minister never misses an opportunity to put out a media release or try to get in the papers about another international movie or show that's decided to temporarily set up shop in Australia. Now, it's great that Thor Ragnarok was filmed here. I love the movie. I think Taika's a genius director. And it's great that the Young Rock or Joe Exotic can be filmed here. I'm not sure if he's bringing the tigers or what's happening. And it'll provide some temporary jobs for local crew. I welcome the overseas productions. I welcome the jobs that they provide. But it is trade policy. It is not cultural policy. These are not Australian stories. What makes it worse is at the same time that they've only cared about the Hollywood productions coming here, under the cover of COVID, the government has been actively undermining and removing supports and incentives for Australian stories on screen. First, under the cover of the pandemic, Mr. Morrison's government suspended quotas for particular genres of Australian-made television, including children's TV, drama and documentaries. I remember them saying that, these changes were temporary. Most of us didn't buy it, and we were right, because on the 1st of January this year, they were effectively made permanent. The government shifted these sub-quotas onto a point system, which effectively abolished any requirement for original Australian children's TV and made it much easier for drama budgets to be cut. He also announced sweeping changes to long-standing taxation offsets used to support Australian screen content. At first, This included reducing the producer offset for feature film from 40% to 30%, with no consultation or apparent rationale. It took a whole lot of celebrities, Brian Brown, Marta Dusseldorp, Justine Clark and Simon Baker, to travel to Canberra to campaign against that for the government to change its mind. Then they tried to halve Foxtel's Australian content requirement. Now think about that. Foxtel have been a good citizen in delivering quality Australian drama. They tried to cut the drama requirement in half. They only backed off because they were facing likely defeat in the Senate. Now the government's playing absurd brinkmanship with another piece of legislation which is sitting in the Senate right now, which combines a welcome increase in the producer offset for television, but with some vicious cuts to other offsets that will affect Australian documentaries and the post-production and visual effects sector. They're trying to hold the sector to ransom, saying, well, if you want to help this sector, you've got to smash the other part of it, which to me just says everything about this government's respect for Australian stories. They're also trying to abolish the Gallipoli clause, the clause that acknowledges that many Australian stories have part of their story being told overseas. And don't just think Gallipoli. Consider a story like Lion or the first season of Jack Irish. Part of telling those Australian stories and part of the story of so many Australians has part of it being told overseas. How a multicultural nation gets to the point of thinking Australian stories stop being Australian if part of the story is from overseas beggars belief. And our third guiding principle, while Mr. Morrison wants a culture war, Australia needs a cultural policy. Labor's been the architect of two cultural policies, Creative Nation under Paul Keating and Creative Australia under Julia Gillard. Labor believes in cultural policies for a really simple reason. Without them, you make the wrong decisions. Cultural policies give us a framework in which to develop arts and culture in Australia. They give us direction and momentum. They are a statement of Australian identity. Paul Keating understood that when he said the task of Creative Nation was to pull the threads of Australia's national life together so we can ride the waves of global change and create our own. We're coming on a decade since the Abbott government abolished Creative Australia with nothing to replace it. It's clear the lack of a cultural policy has given the coalition government licence to either ignore the arts or to be actively destructive. Post-COVID, it's clear that now, more than ever, we need a cultural policy to give us the framework we need to rebuild and the momentum to carry us forward. The experience of the last 18 months has been so tough. Australian arts and culture and the workers within it are resilient, but even the toughest people have been tested. And there's some of them we've lost on the way through. We're at a crossroads, and as we emerge from the lockdown phase of the pandemic, our cultural life will change. The change will be led by artists, but the foundations for that change, the obstacles, the shortcuts, the quality of the canvas that is handed to artists will be deeply affected by whether there is a change of government at the next election. You know, what the pandemic did was drive home how important the arts is for a lot of Australians, for their mental health and well-being, for their sense of identity. This is a moment worth grasping. And while I know I've devoted my words today to policy, allow me to steal the microphone for a moment longer on a personal level. I'm one of the many Australians who has been carried by you during the madness of the last 2 years. I've played your music. I've played it on vinyl. I've streamed it. I've tried to play it on guitar and piano. I've streamed your shows. I bought tickets to online events. I've read your novels in the evening and your poems in the morning. I cannot imagine a time when I have been more reliant on your work. So thank you for what you do. Thank you for the way you've carried us all. And I intend to be in a position where an Albanese Labor government can soon show you all the same level of deep respect that you've shown us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. It's fabulous to hear that from you, and to hear also so many elements of what we have been speaking about here at Reset, particularly in our first day, being echoed in your sentiments, notions of public value, about the Australia Council, and about the role of policy. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now, a reminder to everyone in the room that we will be taking questions. So feel free to pop up your hand whenever you're ready, and there will be a microphone that's coming to you. And for anyone who is online, you can send your questions and we'll also be carrying those through.
Yes, while we're thinking about that, I'd just also like to say, echo what Jess said. One of the things that I think it came up in yesterday's sessions was about wasted time. And you say, when you talked about the, artists are workers, why do I even have to say that? And I think that I came away from yesterday's session thinking, why are we even having to talk about this? And it reminded me of during the Black Lives Matter, one of the activists in New York saying, I don't want to do this. I don't want to be an anti-racist. I want to write music. I want to raise kids. I want to just live a normal life. And it's that feeling of there's so much to do. And there's so much we could be doing. And here we are having this discussion about whether we're actually worth anything. So it's really heartening to hear those kind of words from you, Tony.
Tony, one of the things that the Arts Industry Council has been thinking about and advocating for is about the future of arts education in Australia, particularly the role of tertiary arts education. Can you share with us any thoughts around a Labor perspective about that? We've seen over the last couple of years enormous destruction in the humanities more broadly, but also the closure or the shrinking of so many of these vital sites, university theatre programs and the like. Can you reflect on the importance of tertiary education and what a future might look like to you?
Yeah, it's for Tanya Plibersek to announce anything specific on the policies there. So, but Tanya's passions and commitments are not at all dissimilar to what I've described there. I think possibly the best way to answer, Jessica, is to just start with the concept that why has the government even done this? Because if you're working from a purely economic sense, it wouldn't make sense. So the starting point is they've made a strategic decision that for political reasons they would rather have a culture war, and this is a way of having the culture war. And to deliver the culture war, what do? You claim, right back to where we just were, that the reason these aren't proper courses is because they don't lead to proper jobs. And so the concept of artists as workers, when I was embarrassed to put it forward even as a principle, that takes you to the education decisions that you make as well. Before they did the university funding, they'd done something similar with TAFE, with graphic design courses. And like the idiocy of it is, find me a manufacturing product that doesn't have design as part of its outcome. Find me anything successful in the technology space that they get so excited about that works without people with artistic skills being intrinsic to the development. And beyond all of that, politics and government can't only be about how we live physically more easily. It's also got to attach to what are the reasons to live. What are the things that enrich us? And we can't be scared of that debate. So the education decisions as they've been made, we've railed against them each time. In terms of announcements on funding and things like that and where we'll go, we haven't made yet. But the simplest thing is our decision to, and our decision each time we've been in government to develop cultural policy is the alternative to a culture war. And those education cuts, who were the three groups who got cut, who had trouble accessing JobKeeper? People at universities, arts workers, and at the same time you had cuts to the ABC. What's happening here is a political strategy that diminishes the nation, nothing more, nothing less.
We have a question down the front. Sorry, one over here.
Hi, Tony. My name's Ben. I'm a writer and theatre maker. I'm not sure if you were on the live stream yesterday, but we had a fantastic panel yesterday afternoon, which was around themes of the arts and human rights and democracy, the intersection of all of those things. One of the things that came up in that discussion was around the funding of arts companies and events by fossil fuel companies and the extent to which artists are compromised by those relationships. Now, we all know that the government, as it currently is, has just presided over, frankly, an embarrassing shit show in Glasgow with their climate policy. But as anyone who watched Big Deal that was on ABC recently would know, the Labour Party is almost as complicit as the coalition, accepting around $1 million each year from fossil fuel companies, some of the biggest carbon polluters like Chevron, like Woodside, like Santos. So I really want to know from you why any of the artists and arts workers in this room should be voting for your party come March or May next year.
In terms of, thanks for the question, Ben, and also you're blunt, and I appreciate it. It's something I remember as a minister giving an award to someone who then, in the acceptance speech, just smashed me on another thing I was responsible for, and that's good. I don't mind that at all. In terms of acting on climate change, every election, and it's been, and we've done so fearlessly, every election, our response to climate change in terms of taking serious action on it does not in any way lead to the sort of conclusions that you'd want to imply from what you've just said with respect to funding. Yes, we're in a situation where to have elections, we're in a system of donations. I wish we weren't. I wish we were in a system where public funding carried a much higher proportion of it. I wouldn't be troubled at all if there were caps on funding at all. But in terms of what you've just described, what's it meant for policy? It hasn't had us shy away at any point from serious action on climate change. We in our first term in government introduced laws on climate change, which were at that time blocked by Tony Abbott's opposition and that on that occasion by the Green Party as well. In our second term, we got serious action on climate change through the Parliament. This time the Green Party supported us. And then we were thrown out of office in part on that policy. That hasn't stopped us the previous two elections or even now in advocating for what needs to happen with respect to the planet. There'll always be an argument as to whether people think we're going hard enough, but the choice at every election has been that our arguments about climate change have been far more serious than our political opponents. So I think the simplest answer to what you've described is the record. And if I put it in these terms, if we had won in 2013, or we had won in 2016, or we had won in 2019, Australia's emissions right now would be significantly lower. There is no doubt about that. And we have lost time, and the planet has lost time, while this government has decided to do nothing. Why would you vote for us in that context? It is a choice about getting better action on climate change, and I think the record shows that.
Thank you, Tony and Ben. We have a question from online.
Hi, Tony. My name is Justina. I'm just moderating the live chat here. I have a question from Tina, who thanks you for your heart and mind. She asks, where do you stand on the sector's advocacy having been underpinned by the creative industries narrative all these years?
Look, the truth is I had always been on the side of not arguing the economic cost. I had always worked on the basis that the risk for the sector in arguing the economic value was it then meant if another industry came along that was of more economic value, you'd basically given up an argument about the money just shifting to that one. Now, I guess I never saw Scott Morrison coming. Effectively, I don't know if it was his days in amateur theatre, in Oliver playing the Artful Dodger or what it was, but for whatever reason, he sees the sector as a hobby. And in hindsight, I wish I had run the economic arguments harder because the sector might have got support earlier. Once it was clear that he didn't view these as real jobs, we went hard on the economic cost, hard on how many $1 billion the sector contributed to the economy. We just went full pelt economic, not because it was the most important issue to us, but because we wanted to help. And so we argued it hard. So I think ultimately the narrative about cultural value is the right narrative. I think it's the one that needs to be told. But during a period of Conservative government, I just thought the argument would be that they didn't think the cultural part was important. And so it was the same fight to have. It never occurred to me we'd be in an argument about whether or not this is a real industry. And even just to think the logic of it, how sport can be a real industry and tourism can be a real industry and hospitality can be a real industry, but arts, entertainment and events isn't. But there is no logic to it at any layer. But that said, I think the cultural narrative is the right one that needs to be argued. And I think I was wrong for years thinking the economic value could be successfully left out of the argument. I think it needs to be there. And I wish in my advocacy for you, I'd put it there earlier because I might have been able to get a better outcome for you earlier.
Thanks, Tony. We also have a question from Pippa who asks, if you can imagine a way to join the dots more effectively so that arts and culture are meaningfully embedded in other sector departments and portfolios.
That's what cultural policy does. So, for example, part of the process within government when you put in cultural policy is every department has to think about how does this affect them, because it is a formal policy of the government. So if it's just an arts funding announcement, then the other departments don't need to think about it, don't need to consider it. But whenever, for example, in any policy area that I've had, whether I've been Minister for Agriculture or Minister for the Environment, or for a short time Minister for Immigration, whatever the government's overreaching policies are, and a government always has a handful of them, not a lot, but a handful of them, they feed into every submission and policy idea that comes through. What does that mean? It means that when Veterans Affairs is working out what's the best way to help people who are dealing with post-traumatic stress, looking at how arts work can help them becomes part of the formal policy process of government. It means for each of our embassies and high commissions around the world, the ambassadors have to decide whether or not they have a cultural attaché, and if they don't, justify why they don't have one, because it's part of the government's policy to be promoting our culture overseas. Education, the educational department, when they're looking at where can they make cuts in terms of funding, would have to consider, well, hang on, if we cut this one, that would be inconsistent with the cultural policy. So what you do with having cultural policy as a formal decision-making process within government, you affect every decision throughout government. Now, obviously, there'll be a whole lot of decisions where cultural policy might not be relevant, but I can't think of a portfolio where it's irrelevant. And yet, I can probably guarantee that since we lost office, for the 8 or 9 years we've had so far of this government, that none of the departments have been obliged to think in those terms except for whoever was responsible for the arts, for the very simple reason that cultural policy was abolished the moment they came to office.
We just have another question down the front.
Hi, Tony. It's Emma here from AIXA. Thanks so much for your talk today. I'm just wondering if you can expand a little bit on the democratic role of arts and of a cultural policy in Australia. I think it's obviously relevant to why we need to have and continue to defend our statutory authority, the Australia Council, because I personally believe that is there's a democratic function for the Australia Council, and I was wondering if you can speak to that. But I guess also maybe if you could speak more broadly around the role of media and kind of public conversation. You've kind of touched on it in terms of culture wars, but what are policies that help us have more democratic conversation and cultural conversation in our country? I'm interested in how you feel about the way that ABC has been treated, the calls for a Murdoch inquiry. How can we promote more democracy through a broad cultural policy?
Thank you for that. If I start with the caveat, because sometimes when I answer something along these lines, a misunderstanding occurs. So if I start with the caveat, and then I'll answer the question more directly. The caveat's this: there will be a huge amount of arts work that is not necessarily engaging in a political narrative at all, and that is important. There'll be a huge amount of arts work that challenges on a personal level, that takes the soul somewhere where you might otherwise not be expecting. And that part of the work is critical to the role of the sector as well. Separate to that, though, there is a fearlessness with the arts that is in the national interest and in the democratic interest. And part of that comes through direct political content, which can often be told. If I give a public art example, might be worthwhile. That Caldor art projects, which is something we have here in Sydney each year, where they do a major piece of public art each year. One year, and it was after the Guantanamo Bay stories had all emerged, they set up wire cages on Bondi Beach with beach chairs in them, the exact proportions of what people were being kept in. And it fundamentally changed people's sense of space. Now, that was deeply political, deeply powerful, and a lot of their work changes your sense of the space forevermore. So there can be work that's directly in that form. There'll be other work that is narrative. The big democratic power, though, that I always think is simply in providing the diversity of what it is to live here. And I've been frustrated for a long time that a lot of our screen, it's getting better, but a lot of our screen still doesn't represent Australia as I think Australia logically looks. The recent ABC broadcast that finished a couple of weeks ago called Fires was one of the first times I've seen a drama where the actors were cast with the full diversity of modern Australia. It rarely happens. And to see that on screen was really powerful. But it also means a lot of these stories, in order to be told, will not make money. A lot of them will not be commercial, and that's okay. The part of Sydney where I live, some of you will have heard of suburbs like Punchbowl or Lakemba, where I am. Now, there was a movie made in our local streets called Alex and Eve that had been a stage show written by Alex Lykos, turned into a feature film. Andrea Dimitriades starred in it. It wasn't a commercial success. It was only made possible because of a series of government funding decisions and a whole lot of investors who just believed in the project. But the validation that it gave a community is phenomenal. Similarly, in Melbourne, when Hearts and Bones was told, Hugo Weaving was in it with respect to the newly arrived African community in parts of Melbourne. the validation that comes from that changes political debate. So I think sometimes in answer to a question like this, we go straight to something like the book that came out over the last 12 months, Toxic, about the salmon industry in Tasmania. And you go to something like that where it's overtly political and the purpose is clear. But I think in answer to the question, the most important stuff to focus on as well is where it's a bit more circuitous and where the power of challenging is making us aware of something, of someone, of a way of thinking, of a challenge to space that otherwise wouldn't have been there. And effectively, to be able to do that, you need to know that you're not going to be hunted down by the minister. You need to know that it's not transactional and you won't be punished for it. And sadly, the ABC has been bullied. There's no doubt about that. The Australia Council's been bullied. There's no doubt about that. The culture wars send a message to universities about decisions that they make as well. And when you're bullied, sometimes artists will be fearless anyway and good, but some people won't have the economic confidence to be able to do that. And you get a change behaviour, and we are all diminished when that happens. So the most important part of the democratic process, I believe, is for government to provide a strong platform that then allows fearlessness from artists. And whatever point of creativity that takes them to is okay. The only limitation on support becomes one of artistic merit determined by peers.
Tully has a question there at the front.
Thank you. Thanks for those comments. I might have another one of those tricky questions. So, take this as you go. But I have a question about how you might develop this forthcoming potential cultural policy, given that the Creative Australia 2013 came right at the end of 2 terms of a Labor government. It was there from the 2020 agenda that happened in Canberra in 2008, I think it was, and yet it took right to just before an election at the end of a second term for the policy to come out. And I wonder if you have learned from that time and your time in the shadow role about how to develop good cultural policy that can stick.
Yeah. I have, and this is something that we haven't settled internally yet, but I think the best way I could answer that is in terms of how we promised to deal with this at the last election, which was to not start from scratch, to use Creative Australia as the foundation document and update it. If you start from scratch, it is a process of at least 2.5 years to get cultural policy done. If you start with the raw document and you work on a basis of updating it, then I reckon you can probably do it in a 4 to 6 month process. And I wouldn't want to see the sort of drift that we had last time with waiting for Creative Australia to come. I wasn't the minister when it was being designed. I was the minister, but I was in cabinet, and there are a series of cabinet committees that I was co-opted onto because I had a passionate interest in it, and then I ultimately ended up rolling it out. But I think the simple answer to what's one way that you can make sure you get this moving quickly is, instead of starting from scratch, you have your foundation as the old document and you work to update it. There are some things, for example, of its 5 principles, the first principle was the artist and the centrality of the artist. Now, there's a genuine discussion as to whether the first pillar now, if you're doing it now, whether it should in fact be First Nations, as to whether that should be the starting point. Like you start with the stories and the history and what uniquely we are building on here in Australia. And the artist is still one of the pillars, but you reorder. There were some of the diversity issues which, when it came out and I then became minister for it, I thought it was a bit light on. And so there's some diversity issues that I think you'd really want to update. And the big thing that you need to update is to get a sense of where people are at post-COVID, or at least post this phase of COVID, because the infrastructure has changed, and also we have a change in the role and status of what used to be called the major performing arts companies. So those things would have to be dealt with. But I think if you start with the raw document, you can do it in a very timely way.
I wonder if I could just add a supplement to that, or ask a supplement, because I was very struck by, I was reading Don Watson's account of Paul Keating's days in office, and how he kind of loved and hated going out to the arts sector because they were very blunt but also energizing for him. But it was clear there was so much communication going on between government and arts and culture. And again, when Kevin Rudd comes in 2007, he has the 2020, the big consultation that lasted, I think it was a number of days. And I was just kind of wondering, what we're now in a situation where the public service has been chopped back by the coalition over the last number of years. Public consultation is less and less about public servants, it's more about lobbying. I was just wondering what the role of the cultural sector has in consulting around a new cultural policy, not necessarily the 2020, but how are you going to bring back the sector into effective consultation around such an important thing?
Yeah, some of that, I think some of that, the answer is if we want to do it quickly, some of that won't be as much of a deep dive as you would otherwise want it to be. I think that's the reality. Rebuilding the public sector is in fact possible to do, and remarkably, it's cheap to do, because for all the cuts to the public sector, a whole lot of those, particularly at executive level, have gone off to work for the major accounting firms, and then the government pays 7 times the amount to the accounting firms to get the same advice they used to be able to get in-house. So rebuilding it has an offset in terms of the consultancy fees that are being paid. And it's been, economically, it hasn't made sense the way that they've dismantled the public service. But the public service that I used to get advice from, it doesn't have that capacity right now. And this is where I think the public sector can be rebuilt, and you'd start rebuilding quickly, but realistically, I wouldn't want to wait for the rebuilding before we did the consultation, before we got moving on cultural policy. So I think it does mean the consultation will be the best it can possibly be, but I don't want government going for too long without cultural policy. And that will mean there'll be some compromise in that process. I wish the answer was different.
We have a question from the audience. How do you think your cultural policy will reach local government? And I mean around Australia.
Look, if I can talk about how it happened last time. Last time it meant that our infrastructure funding, because this actually happened before we announced cultural policy, but because we were developing it, the infrastructure policy, one of the things that it had decided to favour was to favour cultural projects. And then the other thing that we were doing was a shift towards to prioritising funding, where instead of it being through these different regional bodies that existed, it being local government as the proponents. Having local government as proponents provides a really helpful probity measure for federal government as well, instead of it being a situation where projects come via, well, look at some of what's been reported, friends or donors. If you've got local government, you've automatically got a probity lens there as well. But when those policies are in place, last time's the best example, there was a direct lens of favouring arts projects being part of that, and local government for us has traditionally been a linchpin of where those grant fundings go.
We have another question.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Tricia. I work at Carclu, which is spends a considerable amount of its time working with early career artists in their 20s. You were talking about the policy and the work that you're doing and looking at for security for arts workers and recognising the insecure and short-term and casual work in this workforce. Early career artists also, of course, experience that, but they don't have the portfolio or the networks or the established practice to fall back on that more experienced and older arts workers and artists have. Are you in any way considering that particular cohort? They're resilient, they're amazing, but my concern is that in 10 or 15 years, they will not be there, and we won't have our 30-year-old, 40-year-old experienced professionals in the industry because they've been wiped out at this period of time.
I don't have anything specific to offer on that, and it sounds from the nature of the question that there's expertise that you have on that would be really helpful to us. So if it's possible to connect after this, I'd be grateful for that, because what you're pointing to, I've thought about in terms of arts workers generally, but I haven't thought about in the sort of depth you've just described as to how that specifically affects the new generation coming through. So if it's possible to connect through my office after this, I'd be really grateful.
Just down the front.
G'day, Tony. I'm Sam Whiting. I'm a lecturer in creative industries here at UniSA. Most of my research is on live music, specifically small live music venues. And small live music venues are pretty interesting because for all intents and purposes and policy settings, they're for-profit capitalist ventures, like more or less. But they do weird things like host knitting circles and open mic nights and things that are public value related. And I'm interested in your thoughts on the role of small cultural institutions, not just commercial, but community, small to medium enterprises and small institutions in the cultural sector more generally, and how Labor might be able to support those ventures.
Yeah, look, what you've described is exactly why we set up the Office of Live Music, which is one of the institutions that has survived because we deliberately housed it within APRA AMCOS rather than housing it within the department. So Brandis wanted to take it as a saving and couldn't. So the Office of Live Music is still there. But the reason we wanted to do that was when we talked to venues, the challenges hit every tier of government. And we needed, so yeah, you had state government policy where, for example, most of the, it's a bit better for me now in my part of Sydney, but most of the venues that I used to go to in my 20s, they'd replace, by the time I was in Parliament, they'd replace the stage with poker machines. And now we're starting to get venues again, but it took a state government legal change to licensing for small bars. The Live Music Office then started advocating for local government changes that we would start having precincts that were designated entertainment precincts, where if a developer came in and people moved in next door to the precinct, they couldn't complain about the noise from that venue because they had chosen to live within an entertainment precinct. And so a series of the challenges that were otherwise occurring, we started to get rid of one at a time. That sort of cooperation and planning and prioritising the live venues that way, I think is the right way to go. When we've been advocating for a targeted wage subsidy, those sorts of venues are exactly what we have in mind. I'm sorry that my examples over the last 6 months are all Sydney, but I haven't been allowed to leave. But you know, a couple of weeks ago, Sky and I went to a gig at Lazy Bones at Marrickville. Now, during the peak of lockdown, when JobKeeper was still around, they were able to open. And they were able to open only because there was a wage subsidy, because otherwise the physical distancing restrictions meant that they could not commercially open and have enough going through the till to be able to pay their staff. So the circumstances have been different each time. But the principle of what you've described and the role of the small venues is something not only do I agree with you on the importance of it and am passionate about, it was with that in mind that policy decisions like the Office of Live Music have been taken.
Something that, there is a question over here while the microphone is making its way. Something that came up yesterday, Tony, in our final session of the day was raised by a fabulous local journalist, Tori Shepherd, about...
Oh, I know Tori.
Yes, you know Tori. About essentially about the rise of independence and thinking about the coming election. And thinking about how, it might look a little bit different given that there is this changing landscape. I wondered how the Labor Party is thinking about this and thinking about it in terms of party membership and thinking about the way that the public is conceiving of our major political parties. I wondered about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so as manager of opposition business, I'd probably have more engagement with the crossbench in the House of Representatives than anyone else does. And on the different occasions over the last few years that we've suddenly and a little bit miraculously had majorities on the floor of the House, it's been with the close cooperation of the independents, including we had that brief period where we were able to get people off Nauru for medical treatment when it was being denied, when we got a bill through both houses of Parliament. Now, depending on your commentator, some commentators will say only possible because of the independents. Other people will say only possible because of us. Truth is only possible because a whole lot of people of goodwill work together. So I've got a good relationship with them. Most of the places where they appear to be putting lots of effort into independence at the moment are in seats currently held by Liberal and National MPs. So, if they're replaced by an independent, good. If they're replaced by Labor, better. But you wouldn't expect me to say anything different to that. What I think will happen is probably what has always happened, which is in elections where people believe there is no significant difference between the major parties, independents do really well. And in election campaigns where people think there is a really clear divide, then people tend to go one way or the other on the major parties. And that happens at moments where people are either determined that the government needs to be changed or are determined that the government must not change. They're the moments where the independent vote goes down. So, for example, 1993, when it was between John Hewson and Paul Keating, the major party vote for both sides was incredibly high. And in elections where it's argued, people don't see the difference, I always do, but people will sometimes argue that, they're the occasions when independents tend to do better. The other thing is some people in very, very safe seats have a view that the side of politics that they might want to get over the line has zero chance, and in those occasions, they will go to an independent. The big issue, I think, at the moment for most of the independents is one of wanting to have an anti-corruption commission. That's sort of the biggest issue that most of them are campaigning on. We have a commitment for delivering an anti-corruption commission. The government obviously made a commitment at the last election they'd do it and have chosen not to. But they're sort of the issues. But with all of that, the only other thing I should say is in 2010, after the election, we entered a formal alliance with members of the crossbench. We would not do that again. We would not do that again.
Thank you. We have a question over here.
Tony, hi, my name is Ben. I work for the Adelaide Youth Orchestras here in South Australia. I've got kind of a two-part question. In youth arts, generally, it's considered as a subsect of funding rather than being part of its own. It kind of gets rolled into education, or it gets rolled into something else that's not part of. So I guess that's a comment for your future cultural policy, to have it as its own thing. And that kind of came from, I guess, a decimation of youth arts funding about 10 years ago. My first role here in South Australia was with a youth arts company that is no longer existing. My question is around private versus public funding. Here in South Australia, and also federally, from youth arts point of view, we're not necessarily that easily to be able to access funding. We're sometimes told just get more philanthropy because there's no money left. And that's a continual thing that we are up against. And I know a lot of the sector is up against at times. But I guess I'd like to know your thoughts around the role of private philanthropy funding for the arts versus public funding.
Yeah, thank you. My concern with private funding is if it has an impact on moral rights. That's when I get concerned. So my view for artists, which will not be the view of every artist, and I get that, but if you can get philanthropic help for what you have already decided you want to do, then I think that is fantastic. If you can only get philanthropic help by changing what it was that you wanted to do, it's at that point that I get worried as to who's making the artistic decision. And in the same way that I don't like a government minister making decisions about artistic merit, I'm not mad on a series of CEOs making those decisions either. I guess the final thing I'd say is there have been a lot of occasions where companies get given government funding for the arts, and what those big companies do is use that money to employ fundraisers, not to produce art, and then the fundraisers go to the philanthropists, and effectively in that process you have to question, are we losing the fact that the funding was given on the basis of a cultural policy, but the eventual decision on the program is being made by philanthropists who will have their own set of red lines? So I think that's the best way I can answer, is just by offering a framework. If the funding is to do what an artist wanted to do, I am not at all troubled by it, and it's just a decision as to whether you feel it's appropriate to take that money. But if the funding is affecting what an artist will do, I'm worried about where we head.
Okay, we have a number of questions to get through. I've got one from the audience, then we'll go to one from online, and then one to the centre of the room. So the question that has come from the audience is regarding the meeting of cultural ministers. So within the current context of the National Cabinet and the COAG reforms, this meeting of cultural ministers was demolished. So what are your thoughts on the value of such a forum and establishing in cultural policy and overseeing its implementation across the states and territories?
I really like it. I used to attend it. The last one I attended was at Mona in Tasmania, was where it was held. Tasmania was hosting that one. But one of the things you get from a cultural ministers meeting is some new and different concepts with public policy. And the creative process that's done with respect to artistic work, to some extent gets not mirrored, we're not as good as that, but gets affected by the concept of what are the creative policy ideas. So for example, it was Tasmania back then that was really pushing how can we better use the arts within healthcare. And it was a huge push, and a whole lot of work was driven around the nation because that was being advanced at the Ministerial Council. But to get the Ministerial Council to work, you have to, as a federal government, bring something to the table. If all you're providing is the table, then you get a conversation, but not a whole lot more. If you are bringing a national cultural policy, some of the states will start emulating and having their own version of it to match. If you're bringing significant funding for creation of new work, then every state will have the usual state rivalry of they want to be the one who gets access to it, and you get a difference there. Last election, for example, we promised to establish a National Indigenous Theatre, and immediately the different states were in contact saying, well, can it be housed here? Can it be housed there? Wanting to leverage off. Now, I think a lot can, and also with the Ministerial Council, the Council of Local Government used to attend as well, and occasionally the New Zealand Minister would attend. All of that together provides a forum that at worst can do no harm, and at its best will drive policy change, and I've seen it drive policy change that otherwise wouldn't have occurred.
Thank you. Justina. Tony, we have another question from the live chat. This one is coming from Alex. She asks, there is still a huge gap in the cultural sector that the Australia Council is not able to fund or develop strategies for museums and galleries. Would your cultural policy be expansive and develop ways to include them in the future?
Quick answer on that. Last time it did, and that's, yeah, I expect that's what we'll be building off, but there are announcements that we haven't yet made.
There is a question from Liz.
Hi, Tony. Yesterday we had some conversation about cultural organization board governance and the legislation surrounding it. And part of that conversation was around mandates for oversight, obviously. But an even greater concern, particularly of mine, is how board members get to hold the positions that they hold and how influence is exerted by corporate interests in some cases. Does Labor, or do you in particular, have any position on cutting the corporate to board pipeline and ensuring that people with knowledge in the sector and people embedded in the communities served get voices on cultural boards?
Yeah, the connection between donors, apparatchiks and board membership at the moment on a series of boards is the worst I've ever seen, by a long way. I have in the 6 years I was in cabinet, I've appointed a lot of boards. Without exception, the one I'm proudest of was the Australia Council board that I appointed. And if I give you a mixture of that, you tried to make sure that you had a difference in representation, regions to city, across the states, cultural difference as well, and backgrounds. And effectively, you had a group of people that would have a challenging conversation around a board. All of them in different ways had been involved in the arts sector. But what I wouldn't want the Australia Council or any of the boards to become, and I know you're not necessarily suggesting this, but I wouldn't want them to effectively become representative boards in the sense of where each board member was there representing their sector or something like that. I think you need to have a skills-based board, but one of those skills is creativity. But some of those skills that you need, like the financial skills or something like that, some of those skills will be held by people who are CEOs and senior business characters. I'm not troubled by them having some of the positions. For that to be effectively the entire decision-making matrix for cultural decisions, I think is rubbish. I think it's appalling, and I think it's what we currently have.
We have only a short amount of time left with Tony. Is there a question from online? Sorry, there's just one here.
Hi, I'm Tony. I've worked in community arts for many years. We sort of predict that if we have a Conservative government, community arts will be the first to go. because it's something that Conservatives don't seem to get at all, that the work we do with communities and in participatory arts is actually work, of course. This also relates to a previous question about participatory arts that also mentioned live music. But I think we expect that a Labor government coming in, as the Whitlam government did many years ago in the 70s, and really regenerated and educated a lot of people about the value of community arts, especially as this is one of the main breeding grounds for future professional artists. I hope that will be in your policy.
I will never be in a situation where we're putting forward something for the sector that doesn't deal with community arts. I'm committed to it. I think it needs to be properly funded, and it changes what it is to live in a community. So it needs to be part of any of those decisions.
Thank you. I wonder if we could just ask a little question really relating to some of the topics that's coming up actually after lunch. And it's going to be, we're going to have a lot of people talking about new ways of not just paying artists, but how, such as UBI, but also questions around cooperatives and encouraging cooperatives and other ways of working. And let me frame it by saying that, you know, the question we had, I think, from online about the creative industries, it's not just about the economic argument, that's one argument, but it's also about the idea, and we heard it yesterday from some of the panelists, about we've all got to be startups, we're all entrepreneurs, we're all, you know, we're all going to be unicorns, and, you know, the model of Silicon Valley, etc. That came, a lot of it came with creative industries. And while at the time, you know, when Keating's time, maybe a good kick up the bum was necessary for some arts institutions. Now people are talking about cooperatives and, you know, music venues as networks of, you know, not-for-profit making things. So I just wondered if these new ideas were in any way kind of coming around, because they weren't in Creative Australia, but if these new ideas have had a space to kind of percolate through to policy ideas.
I don't know the answer to that. A whole lot of, like, I never expected us to be in a world of wage subsidies until lockdowns happened, for example. And now, because of the social distancing requirements, there's a whole lot of areas where wage subsidies are completely appropriate to continue at this point in time. The one thing I will say is, and I'm unfairly picking up on your phrasing here, but anything that begins with "we will all be" won't happen, because it's going to be driven by a diversity of approaches, no matter what. But what that diversity involves and what new forms are around is part of why I'm saying that it's very difficult to announce anything now, because we just don't know what the state will be. But in any of those forms, I want as much as possible to be in a situation where it's not the race to the bottom that it's been for a whole lot of workers in terms of income. But I also don't want to take decisions in such a way that it stops any new creative idea from having a go. I think that's the best I can offer.
Right.
All right, that is just about all the time that we have. Thank you so much, Tony, for your time, for your generous responses, and for the consideration that you shared with us this morning. It's been a real privilege to spend this time with you. So thank you also to everyone who has engaged online and asked questions. And it's been incredible to be able to have this moment for conversation at such a pivotal time. So please join me in thanking the Shadow Minister for the Arts, the Honourable Tony Burke.
Thank you.
Now, for everyone in the room, we will now be taking a lunch break. We will be back here at 1:30 for the next session. As we've said before, lunch is not catered, so please go out and support local businesses. But there is plenty of fruit and cakes and things like that in the foyer. So we will see you back here at 1:30.